Rachel sat in the kitchen the next morning, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. The house was eerily quiet. Ethan had spent the night in the guest room, a self-imposed exile as part of his attempt to give her space. Maddie hadn't come down for breakfast, and Rachel didn't have the strength to call her. She needed a moment to think, to process everything that had been laid bare. But her brief solitude didn't last long. The front door opened, and she heard the familiar sound of Jake's footsteps. Her son was home from college earlier than expected, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he walked into the kitchen. "Mom," he greeted, dropping his bag by the door. "What's going on?" "Maddie called me last night," crying her eyes out. Rachel's stomach sank. Maddie had reached out to Jake, of course, she had. They were close, and Maddie had always idolized her older brother. But the thought of Jake being dragged into this mess felt like another weight pressing down on her. Rachel set her mug down, forcing a small smile. "Hey, sweetheart. I didn't know you were coming home." Jake gave her a long, appraising look, his expression serious. "I didn't plan to, but Maddie freaked me out. She said Dad did something bad. Something about another woman." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. Jake wasn't a child. At 19, he could handle the truth, or at least some version of it. But it didn't make the conversation any easier. "Jake, your dad and I are going through a rough time right now," she began carefully. "There are things we need to work through." "Things?" Jake echoed, his voice rising. "Maddie said Dad cheated on you. Is that true?" Rachel's chest tightened. There was no use in sugarcoating it. She nodded slowly. "Yes, it's true. He made a terrible mistake, and we're trying to figure out where to go from here." Jake's face twisted in anger, and he ran a hand through his dark hair. "What the hell is wrong with him? After everything you've done for this family? For him? How could he be so selfish?" "Jake." "No, Mom," Jake interrupted, his voice trembling with rage. "He doesn't get a free pass for this. He blew up our family because he couldn't keep it in his pants." Rachel reached for his hand, but he pulled away, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Jake, I know you're angry. I am too. But this is complicated. Your dad and I need time to sort through everything." Jake stopped pacing and turned to face her. "Do you even want to fix things with him? After what he did?" Rachel hesitated, the question hitting her like a punch to the gut. Did she want to fix things? Part of her couldn't imagine life without Ethan, the man she had loved and built a life with. But another part of her, the part still reeling from his betrayal, couldn't fathom forgiving him. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I haven't decided yet." Jake shook his head, his jaw tight. "If you ask me, he doesn't deserve another chance. He made his choice, Mom. He chose someone else." Before Rachel could respond, the sound of Ethan's footsteps on the stairs interrupted them. Jake turned toward the sound, his expression hardening as Ethan entered the kitchen. "Jake," Ethan began, his voice tentative. "I didn't know you were coming home." Jake crossed his arms, his stance confrontational. "Yeah, well, I didn't know you were sleeping with the nanny. Guess we're both full of surprises." Ethan's face paled, and he glanced at Rachel, who looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Jake, I know you're angry," Ethan said, his voice steady but strained. "And you have every right to be. I made a mistake, a huge mistake. But I love you, your sister, and your mom more than anything. I'm trying to make this right." Jake laughed bitterly. "Make this right? How? By moving back in like nothing happened? By pretending you didn't betray Mom?" "Jake, stop," Rachel said sharply, her voice breaking. "This isn't helping." Jake turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't just stand here and listen to him act like everything's fine. It's not fine." Ethan stepped closer, his voice filled with emotion. I'm not asking you to forgive me right now, Jake. I just want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not giving up on this family. Jake glared at him, his jaw clenched. You should have thought about that before you slept with Zoe. The name hung in the air like a bomb. Ethan flinched, and Rachel closed her eyes, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Jake grabbed his duffel bag and turned toward the stairs. I'll be in my room, he said coldly. But don't expect me to play nice. The house settled into an uneasy silence after Jake stormed upstairs. Rachel stayed in the kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug as though it could somehow anchor her. Ethan sat across from her, his head in his hands, looking every bit the defeated man. The tension between them felt like a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. The doorbell shattered the quiet. Rachel's head snapped up, her stomach twisting in dread. She didn't need to look to know who it was. The pit in her stomach told her before she even moved. Without a word to Ethan, she stood and walked to the door, her steps slow and deliberate. When she opened it, there stood Zoe, looking pale and nervous. She clutched her purse tightly, as though it were a shield, her eyes darting past Rachel toward the interior of the house. What are you doing here? Rachel asked, her voice sharp and low. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her before Zoe could respond. I'm sorry for showing up unannounced, Zoe said quickly. But I thought it was better to talk in person. Rachel crossed her arms, her patience already wearing thin. We've said everything that needs to be said. No, we haven't, Zoe insisted, her voice trembling. There's more you need to know. Rachel narrowed her eyes, her jaw tightening. What could you possibly have left to tell me? That you've decided to keep the baby? That you've already picked out curtains for your nursery? Zoe flinched, her face crumpling. I know you're angry. Angry? Rachel hissed, stepping closer. Angry doesn't even begin to cover it, Zoe. You've turned my life into a nightmare. So whatever it is you came here to say, make it quick. Zoe swallowed hard, looking down at her shoes. I went to see the other guy, she said softly. The one I was with before Ethan. I told him about the pregnancy, and he wants to be involved. Rachel's breath caught. What are you saying? I'm saying there's a chance the baby isn't Ethan's, Zoe said, her eyes welling with tears. I told him everything, and he wants a paternity test as soon as possible. If the baby is his, I'm willing to walk away, for good. Rachel stared at her, her emotions a chaotic mix of hope, anger, and disbelief. And why should I believe you? You've lied before. What's stopping you from lying now? Zoe shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. I'm not lying, Rachel. I swear. I just want to do what's right, for everyone. Rachel let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the stillness of the morning. What's right? Now you care about doing what's right? You should have thought about that 6 months ago when you decided to sleep with my husband. Zoe nodded, her tears falling freely. I know. And I'll never forgive myself for what I've done to you, to your family. But I can't undo the past. All I can do is try to make things right moving forward. Rachel took a step back, her arms dropping to her sides. She didn't know what to say, what to feel. Zoe's words rang with sincerity, but Rachel wasn't ready to trust her. Not yet. I'll believe it when I see it, Rachel said finally, her voice cold. Get the test done. Prove the baby isn't Ethan's. Until then, stay away from me. Stay away from my family. Zoe nodded, her shoulders slumping. I will. I promise. Rachel turned and walked back into the house, closing the door behind her with more force than necessary. She leaned against it for a moment, taking deep breaths to steady herself. When she turned around, she found Ethan standing in the hallway, his face pale and drawn. Was that Zoe? He asked hesitantly. Rachel nodded, her expression hard. She came to tell me there's a chance the baby isn't yours. Ethan blinked, the news clearly catching him off guard. What? She didn't tell me that. No, she didn't, Rachel said, her voice sharp. Because she knew you wouldn't want to hear it. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, looking lost. What happens now? Rachel stared at him for a long moment. What happens now is that she gets the test. And if the baby isn't yours, you'll have one less excuse for what you've done. But it won't erase the damage, Ethan. Nothing will. Ethan nodded slowly, his expression grim. I know. I just want a chance to make things right. Rachel didn't respond. Instead, she walked past him, heading upstairs to check on Maddie and Jake. She didn't have the energy for another confrontation, not when her children needed her. For now, she would focus on them, on the pieces of her life that were still worth fighting for. The days following Zoe's unexpected visit passed in a tense haze. Rachel kept herself busy with the clinic and the children, while Ethan kept his distance, clearly aware that pushing for forgiveness too soon would only backfire. Maddie remained withdrawn, avoiding her father whenever possible, while Jake oscillated between anger and silence. The once vibrant Harper household now felt like a battlefield riddled with emotional landmines. Then, late one afternoon, Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. Zoe, the paternity test results are in. It's not Ethan's. I thought you'd want to know. Rachel stared at the message, her heart pounding. A strange mix of relief and anger coursed through her. She forwarded the message to Ethan without adding a single word, then turned her attention back to the dental chart she had been reviewing. But her focus was shattered, her mind racing with what this news meant. That evening, Ethan found her in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup for dinner. His footsteps were tentative, and when Rachel turned to face him, she could see the weight of the past weeks etched into his features. I got Zoe's message, he said, his voice low. Rachel nodded, her expression unreadable. So, it's not yours. Ethan let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. No, it's not. You sound relieved, Rachel said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the air. I am, Ethan admitted. But that doesn't change anything, does it? Rachel turned off the burner and faced him fully, crossing her arms over her chest. No, it doesn't. It doesn't erase the lies or the betrayal. It doesn't undo the pain you've caused this family. Ethan flinched at her words, but he didn't argue. Rachel, I know I've ruined everything, but I still love you. I want to fix this. I want to earn back your trust, no matter how long it takes. Rachel shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. Trust? Ethan, do you even know how impossible that feels right now? Every time I look at you, all I see is what you did. Ethan stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I'm not asking for an instant fix. I know I have to work for it. I'll do anything, therapy, moving out, giving you space. Whatever you need. Rachel studied him, her heart aching with the weight of his words. She wanted to believe him, to believe that the man she had married was still in there somewhere. But the scars of his betrayal were fresh, and forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb. I need time, she said finally, her voice breaking. And you need to be patient. For once in your life, Ethan, you need to think about someone other than yourself. He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. I'll wait as long as it takes. Later that night, Rachel gathered Maddie and Jake in the living room. She had debated whether to tell them about the paternity results but decided they deserved the truth. They had been dragged into this mess, and keeping secrets would only breed more resentment. Maddie sat on the couch, her arms wrapped around her knees, while Jake leaned against the armrest, his face set in a hard line. I wanted to let you both know that Zoe got the results of her paternity test, Rachel began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. The baby isn't your father's. Maddie's head shot up, her eyes wide. What? So, she lied? No, Rachel said quickly. She didn't know for sure. But now we have confirmation. Jake scoffed, shaking his head. So, Dad gets to walk away from this mess scot-free? That's just great. Jake, it's not that simple, Rachel said, her voice tinged with frustration. Your father still made choices that hurt this family, and we're dealing with those consequences. Maddie's lip quivered as she looked at her mother. Does this mean you're going to stay together? Rachel hesitated, her heart breaking at the hope in her daughter's eyes. I don't know yet, Maddie. Your dad and I have a lot to figure out. But I want you both to know that no matter what happens between us, we love you. That will never change. Maddie nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jake, however, stood abruptly, his expression stormy. You might love us, but he sure as hell doesn't act like it. Jake. Rachel said sharply, but her son was already walking out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Rachel exhaled shakily, pulling Maddie into a hug. It's going to be okay, sweetheart. I promise. But as she held her daughter, she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, Maddie or herself. The days following Zoe's revelation passed in a strained but calmer atmosphere. Maddie and Jake were subdued, each processing the news in their own way. Ethan continued to tread lightly, giving Rachel as much space as possible while still attempting to stay present for their children. Rachel, meanwhile, threw herself into work at the clinic, avoiding prolonged conversations or confrontations at home. One evening, Rachel arrived home to find the house eerily quiet. Maddie was in her room, the glow of her laptop spilling into the hallway. Jake had left earlier for a late-night study session at a friend's place, and Ethan wasn't in sight. She hung her coat by the door, relishing the moment of peace. When she walked into the kitchen, she froze. The table was set, not with their usual everyday plates, but with the fine china they had received as a wedding gift. A bottle of her favorite wine stood in the center, flanked by 2 flickering candles. Ethan appeared from the pantry, holding a basket of freshly baked bread. He smiled nervously when he saw her. Hey. Rachel crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. What's all this? I thought, maybe we could have dinner together, Ethan said, setting the basket on the table. No kids. No distractions. Just us. Rachel hesitated, her instinct to say no clashing with a pang of curiosity, and a flicker of nostalgia. It had been years since Ethan had done something like this. She remembered the early days of their marriage, when spontaneous gestures of love had been the norm. Back then, he had always found ways to surprise her, to make her feel special. But that was before the years had worn them down, before the betrayal. You can't think a nice dinner will fix everything, she said, her voice soft but guarded. Ethan nodded, his expression earnest. I know it won't. But I want to try. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't even begin to comprehend. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to see that I'm willing to put in the effort. Not for me, but for us. Rachel looked at him, her heart a storm of conflicting emotions. She wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the walls she had built to protect herself. But a part of her, a small, fragile part, wanted to believe he was sincere. Fine, she said finally. But don't expect this to mean anything. Ethan smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and gratitude. Thank you. As they ate, the silence between them was heavy but not entirely uncomfortable. Ethan had made her favorite dishes, roasted salmon with dill and lemon, a side of creamy mashed potatoes, and asparagus drizzled with balsamic glaze. The effort he had put into the meal was obvious, but Rachel kept her guard up, unwilling to let herself relax completely. I was thinking about our first anniversary the other day, Ethan said, breaking the silence. Remember? We went to that tiny cabin in the mountains, and it rained the whole weekend. Rachel's lips twitched, despite herself. We stayed inside the whole time and burned half the woodpile trying to keep the fireplace going. And we ended up roasting marshmallows over the stove because I couldn't get the fire lit properly, Ethan added, a small laugh escaping him. Rachel looked down at her plate, a bittersweet smile on her face. It was a good weekend. It was, Ethan agreed, his tone soft. We were happy then. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rachel met his gaze, and for a moment, she saw the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But the image was fleeting, overshadowed by the weight of his betrayal. I don't know if we can ever get back to that, Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Too much has happened. Too much has changed. Ethan reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. I don't want to go back. I want to move forward. I want to rebuild, Rachel. No matter how long it takes. Rachel stared at his outstretched hand, her heart aching with the enormity of the decision before her. Could she really let him back in? Could she risk trusting him again, knowing the damage he was capable of inflicting? I don't know, she said finally, pulling her hand away. I need time, Ethan. I can't just pretend everything's okay. I understand, Ethan said, his voice tinged with sadness but also determination. I'll wait. As long as it takes. The dinner with Ethan lingered in Rachel's mind for days. While part of her appreciated his effort, the other part resented the memories it dredged up, their happiness before everything went wrong, before his betrayal. She wasn't ready to forgive, and she certainly wasn't ready to forget. One evening, as Rachel folded laundry in her bedroom, Maddie appeared at the door, clutching her phone and looking unusually serious. Mom, can we talk? Rachel set the laundry aside and patted the bed next to her. Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind? Maddie sat down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About you and Dad. Rachel's heart sank. She had tried to shield Maddie from the worst of it, but her daughter was no fool. It's okay to feel upset or confused, Maddie. This has been hard on all of us. I know, Maddie said, her voice trembling. But I've also been thinking about what it means for me. Like, if you and Dad don't stay together, what does that mean for love? For relationships? How can I trust anyone if even you and Dad couldn't make it work? Rachel felt a pang of guilt and sadness. She had always tried to be a good role model for her children, to show them the importance of love, respect, and communication. But now, she wondered if she had failed. Oh, Maddie, Rachel said, pulling her daughter into a hug. What your dad and I are going through doesn't mean love isn't real or worth pursuing. Relationships are complicated, and sometimes people make mistakes. Big ones. But that doesn't mean love doesn't exist or that you can't find someone who will treat you with respect and care. Maddie sniffled, leaning into her mother's embrace. But what if I get hurt? What if I end up like you? Rachel swallowed hard, her throat tightening. I can't promise you won't get hurt, Maddie. That's part of life, unfortunately. But I can promise you this, you'll be strong enough to handle it. And you'll always have me and Jake to lean on. Maddie pulled back slightly, her eyes red and filled with tears. You're so strong, Mom. I don't know how you do it. Rachel smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Maddie's face. Because I have you and your brother. You're my strength, Maddie. No matter what happens with your dad, that will never change. The next morning, Rachel found a handwritten letter on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to her in Ethan's familiar scrawl. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, her hands trembling slightly. The letter was long, filled with raw emotion and apologies. Ethan wrote about his regrets, his shame, and his determination to be a better husband and father. He didn't try to excuse his behavior, instead, he owned up to his mistakes and acknowledged the pain he had caused. One line stood out. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Rachel, but I hope you'll let me keep trying. Not because I expect you to take me back, but because you and the kids are the most important things in my life. I'll do whatever it takes to prove that to you. Rachel's eyes blurred with tears as she read the letter. For the first time, she sensed genuine remorse in Ethan's words. But words weren't enough. She needed to see action, consistent, meaningful action, to believe he was truly committed to change. As she folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope, Maddie entered the kitchen, her expression cautious. "What's that?" "A letter from your dad," Rachel said, setting it down. "He's trying." Maddie nodded slowly, then reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. "I have something I want to show you." Rachel furrowed her brow as Maddie unlocked her phone and handed it to her. On the screen was a series of photos, family photos. Maddie had compiled snapshots from vacations, holidays, and everyday moments, all showing the Harpers at their best, smiling, laughing, together. "I've been looking at these a lot," Maddie said softly. "I don't want to lose this, Mom. I don't want us to fall apart." Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat as she scrolled through the images. She saw the life they had built, the love that had once been so strong. And she saw her children, their joy, their innocence, their trust in their parents. "I don't want that either, Maddie," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's going to take time. And it's going to take effort from all of us." Maddie nodded, her eyes shimmering with hope. "I just want us to be okay." Rachel pulled her daughter into a hug, her heart heavy with the weight of Maddie's words. She wanted that too, for her, for Maddie, for Jake. And maybe, just maybe, for Ethan. Rachel decided that the family needed to reconnect, even if only for the children's sake. After much thought, she proposed a family outing, a simple day at the park where they could try to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Maddie was cautiously optimistic, while Jake was less enthused, muttering, "This isn't going to fix anything." Ethan, for his part, agreed immediately, his eyes lighting up at the opportunity to spend time with his family. They arrived at the park on a bright Saturday morning. Maddie brought her sketchbook, hoping to find inspiration in the sprawling green landscape, while Jake kicked a soccer ball against a nearby wall, clearly uninterested in engaging with anyone. Rachel set up a picnic blanket, placing a thermos of coffee and a basket of sandwiches in the center. Ethan hovered nearby, trying to gauge the mood without overstepping. "Nice day," Ethan said, attempting to make conversation as he sat down beside Rachel. "It is," she replied curtly, focusing on unpacking the basket. She wasn't ready to forgive, and she wasn't about to pretend everything was fine. Maddie, sensing the tension, broke the silence. "Mom, look," she said, holding up a rough sketch of a couple walking hand in hand. "I think I'm getting better at shading." Rachel smiled genuinely, her heart warming at her daughter's enthusiasm. "It's beautiful, Maddie. You have such a gift." Ethan leaned over to admire the drawing. "It's really good, Maddie. You've got talent." Maddie blushed slightly, mumbling a quiet, "Thanks." Jake, however, snorted from where he sat. "Don't act like you're the supportive dad now," Jake said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We all know it's fake." "Jake," Rachel said sharply, her tone laced with warning. "That's enough." "No, it's not," Jake shot back, standing and glaring at Ethan. "He doesn't get to sit here and act like nothing happened. Like he didn't ruin everything." Ethan looked up at his son, his expression pained. "Jake, I know I messed up. I'm trying to fix things." Jake laughed bitterly. "Fix things? You think showing up to a picnic and pretending to care is going to fix this? You're a joke, Dad." Rachel stood, placing herself between Jake and Ethan. "Jake, sit down," she said firmly. "We're not doing this here." "Why not?" Jake demanded. "It's not like it's a secret. He's the one who destroyed our family." Ethan rose slowly, his voice calm but firm. You're right, Jake. I did. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm still your father, and I love you. Nothing will ever change that. Jake's jaw clenched, his fists balling at his sides. You don't love us. If you did, you wouldn't have done it in the first place. Rachel stepped forward, placing a hand on Jake's arm. Jake, I know you're angry, but this isn't the way to handle it. Let's sit down and talk. Jake shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I can't do this, he said, turning and walking away toward the parking lot. Maddie looked after her brother, her expression stricken. Mom. Stay here, Maddie, Rachel said quickly. I'll talk to him. Rachel caught up to Jake as he leaned against the car, his head bowed. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and he stiffened but didn't pull away. Jake, she said softly. I know this is hard. It's hard for all of us. But walking away won't make it any easier. He turned to her, his face twisted with emotion. I don't understand, Mom. How can you even look at him? How can you sit there and act like there's a chance you'll forgive him? Rachel sighed, her heart aching at the pain in her son's voice. I don't know if I can forgive him, Jake. But I do know that carrying all this anger will only hurt us more. I'm trying to figure out what's best for me, for you and Maddie, for all of us. Jake wiped at his eyes, his voice breaking. I hate him for what he did to you. You don't deserve this. Rachel pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. I know, sweetheart. I know. But you can hate what he did without hating him. He's still your dad, and he still loves you. I'm not asking you to forgive him overnight, but I want you to try to let go of some of that anger, for your sake, not his. Jake nodded against her shoulder, his body trembling. I'll try, Mom. But it's hard. I know, Rachel whispered. We'll get through this. Together. When Rachel and Jake returned to the picnic blanket, they found Ethan and Maddie sitting quietly. Maddie was showing her father her sketches, and Ethan was listening intently, his expression soft and focused. Rachel couldn't remember the last time she had seen him so present, so engaged with their daughter. As the day wound down, Ethan surprised them all by suggesting a game of frisbee. To Rachel's surprise, Jake agreed, though his reluctance was obvious. The four of them played together for the first time in months, and for a brief moment, it felt almost normal. Almost. Rachel lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. The day at the park had gone better than she expected, but the fractures in their family were still painfully visible. Jake's anger, Maddie's hope, Ethan's guilt, all of it swirled in her mind, leaving her no closer to the answers she desperately needed. She turned her head toward the envelope on her nightstand, the letter Ethan had written her. She had read it several times since he gave it to her, each time feeling a little closer to understanding the man she had once loved. But understanding wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't trust. The next morning, Rachel decided she couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. She asked Ethan to meet her in the sunroom, a quiet space at the back of their home where they had spent many evenings together in the early years of their marriage. Ethan arrived promptly, looking nervous but determined. You wanted to talk, he asked, sitting down across from her. Rachel nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, the kids, and where we go from here. Ethan's shoulders tensed, but he nodded, silently urging her to continue. I've realized something, Rachel said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. No matter what happens, I can't erase the years we've shared or the family we've built. But I also can't pretend that what you did didn't break something in me, something I don't know if I can ever fully mend. Ethan's face fell, but he didn't interrupt. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Rachel admitted. But I've also seen how much effort you've been putting in, not just for me, but for Maddie and Jake. And I think you deserve the chance to prove that you're capable of being better. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope breaking through his guilt. Does that mean? It means I'm willing to try, Rachel said, holding up a hand to temper his enthusiasm. But it's not a blank slate, Ethan. It's going to take time, and I need to see real, consistent change. If I even feel like you're slipping back into old habits, it's over. Ethan nodded earnestly. I understand, Rachel. I'll do whatever it takes. Rachel's voice softened. I'm doing this for Maddie and Jake as much as for myself. They deserve to see what it looks like to fight for something, even when it's broken. That evening, Rachel and Ethan gathered Maddie and Jake in the living room. Rachel could feel the tension in the air, especially from Jake, who sat with his arms crossed, his expression guarded. We wanted to talk to you both, Rachel began, glancing at Ethan before continuing. Your dad and I have decided to try to work on our marriage. Maddie's face lit up with tentative hope, while Jake's expression darkened. Before you say anything, Rachel said, addressing Jake directly, this isn't about pretending everything is fine or forgetting what's happened. It's about seeing if we can rebuild something for all of us. And it's not going to be easy. Jake shook his head, his jaw tight. I don't get it. Why give him another chance after what he did? Because sometimes, Rachel said gently, people make terrible mistakes, but they can still change. I'm not asking you to forgive him right now, Jake. I'm asking you to give us the space to try. Jake looked at his mother for a long moment, then sighed and nodded reluctantly. I still don't like it, but I'll try. Maddie smiled faintly. I think it's a good idea. I mean, if you both think it's worth it, then maybe it is. Rachel felt a wave of relief at her children's responses, even if Jake's support was begrudging. She knew this was only the beginning of a long, difficult journey, but it was a step forward, and for now, that was enough. Over the next few weeks, Ethan and Rachel began attending marriage counseling. It was uncomfortable at first, but gradually, they began to unearth the roots of their problems, confronting issues they had ignored for years. Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust he had broken, not just with Rachel but also with Maddie and Jake. Rachel, meanwhile, focused on finding herself again. She started taking yoga classes, rekindled her love of painting, and leaned on her friends for support. She was determined not to lose herself in the process of healing her marriage. There were setbacks, of course. Arguments flared, and doubts crept in. But there were also moments of connection, shared laughter at the dinner table, quiet evenings spent talking, and small gestures that reminded Rachel of the man Ethan used to be. Months later, Rachel sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Ethan joined her, sitting quietly by her side. The silence between them was comfortable, a sign of how far they had come. Do you think we'll make it? Ethan asked, his voice soft. Rachel turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. I think we have a chance. And for now, that's enough. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was real. And for Rachel, that was all she needed.